In this video, I'll talk about capacitor. A capacitor is an electrical device which stores electrical energy by storing charges. This is the symbol for a capacitor. So here you have two parallel lines of equal length. This symbol is used for the unpolarized capacitor. And this is the electrolytic capacitor. One straight line, the other curved line, almost half circle. So this is a symbol for electrolytic capacitor or the polarized capacitor or the polar capacitor. And do not get confused with the symbol of a capacitor and a battery. A battery or a cell also has two lines, but they are of unequal length. The bigger length corresponds to the positive terminal and the smaller line corresponds to the negative terminal. Here there are varieties of capacitor, but in this video I'll only talk about the two types of capacitor, unpolarized capacitor and the electrolytic capacitor. As the term says, unpolarized capacitor, that means it can be used either way in a circuit. You do not have to worry about the positive and negative terminal. You just connect it. Just like a resistor, you do not look at this is a positive terminal or a negative terminal. You just connect them in a circuit. So for example, here, this capacitor, this is the positive terminal and this is the negative terminal, and this is the negative terminal and positive terminal. It doesn't matter how do you connect it because this is unpolarized capacitor. So the example of unpolarized capacitors are the ceramic capacitor, glass capacitor, the Teflon capacitor. As such capacitor can be used either way with a positive negative or negative positive. It also called the bipolar capacitor. Okay, because it doesn't matter which way you connect, so it does not have any preferred polarity. That's the reason it is also called the bipolar capacitor. This capacitor or such capacitor are mostly used in AC alternating circuits. The alternating circuits, the one time the positive and the negative, the current fluctuates or the voltage fluctuates. So that's the reason it is mostly used in the AC circuits. If you look at the value of the capacitors for the unpolarized capacitor, it usually have low capacitance and the value is on the order of picofarad to nanofarad. That's the most available unpolarized capacitor you will get in the picofarad or nanofarad. And remember, 1 picofarad, this is the picofarad, P stands for pico, is 1 times 10 to the negative 12. And 1 nanofarad is 1 times 10 to the negative 9. F stands for the farad. F stands for farad, which is the unit of capacitance. Usually, such capacitors are very inexpensive. You'll get this kind of capacitor about the 10 cents. And also, this capacitor can be operated at a high voltages, or such capacitors are available whose voltage rating is high. And the voltage rating varies from 2 kilovolt to 100 kilovolt. So you can get this capacitor which can be used even up to 100 kilovolt. If you look at the capacitors, you'll see the capacitor, the description of the capacitor is given by the capacitance and the working voltage. So the non-polarized capacitors are available up to, which can stand up to 100 kilovolt. And here are the symbols of the photographs of the ceramic capacitors. Now let me talk about the electrolytic capacitor or the polarized capacitor. So as I mentioned, this is also called the polarized capacitor. So the difference between the unpolarized capacitor and the polarized capacitor mainly is because it has to be connected in a certain way in a circuit. So this terminal, as you can see, a polarized capacitor has the one longer length and the other shorter length here. So usually this has to be connected to the positive terminal of the battery, and this has to be connected to the negative terminal of the battery. And you can also see this is the negative sign. That means it has to be connected to the negative terminal of the battery. Such capacitors are called the radial capacitor. It has the leads coming in the same direction. And the other capacitor, here all are the electrolytic capacitor. The leads are coming from the opposite ends. And this is called the axial capacitor because of the axis, just like an axis here. The axial capacitor. The cost of the axial capacitor varies from 50 cents to $3. And for the radial capacitor, the cost varies from $1 to $5. And there is another type of capacitor. This is called the screw type capacitor. So you can have your terminals connected here. And this one is expensive capacitor, usually about $22, $25. But what you have to look at is the value of the capacitance and the working voltage. If I'm zooming here, you see this one is 2200 microfarad, 2200 microfarad. So it's a big capacitor, and the working voltage is 500 volt. Now just take a look at this capacitor. This is 220 microfarad capacitor. So the screw type capacitor is about 10 times. So this capacitor is 10 times more than the axial capacitor. This is just the one of the example. This is not the example. You'll see a variety of capacitors. And while if you look at the radial capacitor, so this one is this has a 5 times greater capacitance than axial capacitor, but the working voltage is only 6.3 volt. So what you see the difference between the electrolytic capacitor and the non-polarized capacitor is the working voltage is usually much smaller for the electrolytic capacitor. And the reason is, if you open a capacitor, all the capacitor has a metal plate and a dielectric and again a metal plate. That's how the capacitor is built. So in case of the electrolytic capacitor, this dielectric is an oxide layer, and this oxide layer is very thin. It's very thin. And so if you connect this capacitor in a wrong way, let's say you connect this one to negative and this has connected to the positive, what will happen? The oxide layer starts conducting, or you will break the oxide layer and the capacitor will blow away. So this is so you see the differences between the unpolarized capacitor and the polarized capacitor. For the polarized capacitor or the electrolytic capacitor, the capacitance is usually high, but the working voltage is low. And this is mostly used in the DC circuit. You cannot use this one in AC circuit because it has a preferred polarity, while the unpolarized capacitor can be used either in the DC or in AC circuit, but mostly in the AC circuits. And again, the last thing I will just mention again, so inside a capacitor, it doesn't matter if this is a parallel plate capacitor and this is a cylindrical capacitor. So this is a metal plate. If you just look at the cross-sectional view, this is one cylinder, and inside it there is another cylinder, and between this is filled with some sort of dielectric. And as this is in the form of a cylinder, this is called cylindrical capacitor. And in case of a parallel plate capacitor, you have a metal plate. You have a metal plate, and between the metal plates, some sort of dielectrics. And this kind of capacitor is called parallel plate capacitor. Okay. So this is it for the introduction to a capacitor. Again, if you have any questions about capacitor, write down your question in the comment section below. And again, do not forget to subscribe the channel. Thank you so much.